Start. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this IUA market briefing on the SCAP refresher with our guest speaker, Charlotte Warr. It's lovely to have Charlotte back with us to do this refresher course, and I know that you're going to have a very interesting and educational 90-minute session. My name is Deborah Finch. I am the IUA Events Manager. If you would like more information on events that the IUA undertake and produce, please see our website, or you can contact me directly for any information you need, or if you want to be added to our database. So we are going to start the event today, but please note, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Now, during this presentation today, Charlotte will have some polls. All good fun, don't worry. If you can't answer, please don't fret. But please, if you want to participate, the results will come up and that will help you with this educational session. So without further ado, I'd like to just say thank you very much to Justin, our host, for helping with this event, and introduce Charlotte. Thank you, Charlotte.
Okay, thank you very much, Debs. And for those of you who are quick to spot, she's not actually in the UK at the moment. She's speaking to us from across the pond. So you're just showing off there with the World Trade Center.
Welcome from New York. Yes. Oh, by the way, sorry, Charlotte, I forgot to say we are recording this session and it will be sent post-event once we've looked at all the technical issues with it. Thank you. So, Charlotte, you can continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Which means cropping out my being rude about you. Okay, good afternoon to everybody. It's nice to see that we've got 84 people plus Debs, myself and Justin who aren't going to the Sevens. And if any of you are daft enough to actually be dialing in from the Sevens, then you need to get a life. So, topic of the day, you can see there is the SCAP refresher. So the Single Claims Agreement Party Clause has been around for some time now, but we consider it a really useful exercise just to remind people, wherever you fit within the market ecosystem, about how it works. Because the harsh reality is that whilst the clause is a good idea, the technology on which claims are handled in London is not entirely supportive. As Deb said, we're going to have some polls as we go through. All of the answers are anonymous, and some of them are aimed at any brokers we have around the table. Some of them are aimed at underwriters or underwriting side of the business we have around the table. And it's just to get a sense of the mood of the room, as it were, in terms of both levels of understanding and also attitudes. We have a chat function, but we also have a Q&A function as well. And if you've got any questions particularly you want to raise, then actually if you put them in the Q&A, then I'm keeping an eye on that as well, and I will deal with them as they come up and hopefully wrap them all up at the end. So these are our objectives. We just want to remind you why the Single Claims Agreement Party Clause was created in the first place. And particularly just think about it very practically, how it fits within contractual paperwork, where it can be used, where it can't be used in terms of different ways of writing business, and then also think about the practicalities. And then right at the end, I'm going to give you a sense of where the market is in terms of the future for SCAP as well. So, as I've said, the whole idea is all of the polls are anonymous. So, the concept of the Single Claims Agreement Party wasn't a new one. It's basically leader-only claims agreement. And that is not a new concept at all. I've been in the market since the mid-1980s, and I've seen it cycle round over and over again. But it recognised the fairly universal truth that there are a healthy proportion of claims, and the proportions differ in different classes of business, which just don't need two pairs or more pairs of eyes on them. There's no value add for anybody in the process at all by having multiple decision makers involved with them. And so what we're all aiming for, of course, is top quality claim service, and of course, therefore, no client detriment, and everybody benefits. Insurers benefit, brokers benefit, and of course, ultimately, the clients benefit. So the basic ethos is this. We'll get into a bit more detail in a minute, but basic ethos is this, that financially, the net value of the claim to any particular slip, and that's important, we'll come back to that in a minute, for all of the insurers that have agreed to be part of the SCAP family. So that could be Lloyd syndicates, it could be insurance companies, and it could be overseas insurers. So the net value of the claims of all of those insurers on that slip, sub 250,000 sterling or equivalent. Now, of course, one of the things we're going to be talking about is the fact that some claims are volatile, and what the leader and the broker should be thinking about around the eligibility criteria if the numbers might be relatively small now, but it's got the potential to bounce. Another important criteria is that there must be nothing complex or controversial about this. So as we'll see a bit later on, you know, a sniff of sanctions, no. A sniff of anything to do with Medicare, no. And then also, last but not least, you can't have a claim within the SCAP framework if there is active coverage proceedings in train. So, Justin, could we have our first question, please? And this is for our brokers sitting around the table. So hopefully, just choose an answer and click submit if the technology is going to work. And then in due course, I will ask Justin to show the answers, but we'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to vote at this point. Okay, well, let's see if anybody's voted. So, Justin, can we see the answers, please? Or can we see the results? There we go. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this session, we will get rid of the problems that are highlighted in answers 1 and 2. We'll talk about the underwriters in a moment. I'm glad that none of you are forgetting to put it in the slip, because it is a basic part of the MRC slip template, so that shouldn't be an issue anymore. We'll come back to the limits point in a moment, and we'll also come back to the any other reason. And for those of you that wrote any other reason, if you want to actually pop something either in chat or in the Q&A, that would be very helpful. So thank you for that, Justin. Can we have question number 2, please, which is targeted at our insurer colleagues and particularly underwriters if they're sitting around the table with us. Okay, hopefully everybody that wants to vote has had a chance to vote. So Justin, can we have a look at those answers as well, please? Okay, well, again, hopefully we will get rid of the first 2 by the end of the session. Now, with the in-house instructions not to use it, of course, what's quite interesting to dig into there is why that's the case. And I suspect some of it may be linked to the one above, which is something that comes out every time that we actually do this. And it's obviously concerning, and certainly from Lloyd's perspective, they are looking at it from the higher level to say, right, you know, bearing in mind that there is a certain expected level of quality in anybody's claims team that is looking to be a leader, you know, what are the issues sitting around that? Anyhow, thank you for that, Justin, and thank you for those of you that voted. So let's now crack on. So If you are a broker, particularly a placing broker, then of course the starting point to ultimately allow your claims colleagues to be able to use it is to be aware of the fact that it exists and also make sure that it's in the slip. The making sure that it's in the slip shouldn't really be too much of a problem, as I said, nowadays, because it is built in to the MRC version 3 templates. So if your internal templates are following those models, that shouldn't be an issue. But also be clear that there are certain structures of contract that you can't use it for. So you can't use it on binding authorities at all, and you can't use it on proportional treaties. Therefore, putting that in reverse, you can use it on open market, you can use it on line slips, you can use it on non-proportional treaties. The next thing you need to think about is who is going to be the slip leader? Who is going to be our, as I call it, intellectual decision maker? Now, the rules of the game are this. The insurer that is going to fulfill that role can only be one of either a Lloyd syndicate or a UK authorised company. So be aware that a UK authorised company is not an IUA member. They might be an IUA member, but equally they might not be. It's just, do they hold FCA PRA authorisation? They may not choose to belong to that industry body. And so you could, it would be unusual, but you could have a UK authorised insurer from outside the London market, theoretically as a slip leader. Really good question come in about why SCAP can't be used on binders. In terms of that question, I think the when SCAP was originally envisaged, I think what the original problem was that age-old thing of binders are too difficult. They're a completely different animal, a completely different mechanism. Even back then, certainly from the claims side, there was already the spectre of the co-lead claims agreement. It was all felt to be too complicated. Whether it will continue to be too complicated going forward, I don't know, and I'll come back to that point in due course. One of the most important UK insurance companies that could be a SCAP slip leader is Lloyd's Insurance Company, or Lloyd's Brussels, if you want to call it that. And it is important to understand that it is an insurance company, and it is a UK insurance company as well, because although it's domiciled in Belgium, and that's the whole point of its existence, there is a UK branch, and so that fits the bill quite nicely. Overseas markets cannot be the SCAP slip leader, but absolutely, as a broker, you can try and persuade them to be bound by SCAP. That's absolutely fine. They may not agree, but that desire to try and get overseas market to commit to it is one of the reasons that actually, again, if you look at the MRC V3 slip template, you will see actually that the best practice is actually that the full wording of the SCAP clause is built into the slip, which is, it's about 6 pages long, but to allow that transparency with any following market in the overseas arena, so they know exactly what they're signing up to. And then last but least, of course, you want to make sure that, having done all that goodly work about putting it in the slip, that your claims team actually know how to use it. So we've talked about some of the scenarios that both are popping up on the broking side and the underwriting side, that there is reluctance on the part of some insurers to use it. And I'm not here to try and resolve that. It is what it is. But in terms of how the kind of choice to be committed to SCAP goes, on the company side, every insurer, of course, does their own thing. So if the Allianz is on the slip and they say, right, we're happy to be bound by SCAP, doesn't oblige the Swiss Re to be bound by SCAP. On the Lloyd's side, the reverse is true. If the Lloyd's leader says, yep, we're happy to have SCAP in the slip, then all the other Lloyd's placement on that UMR are bound by that. Now, going to the point that we saw pop up in those polls, what does it mean in practice then for a broker if they've got 5 Lloyd's syndicates who are happy to be bound by SCAP and 1 that is not? Well, we're now into splitting out an off-slip territory. And again, it is what it is. It just becomes, of course, then inherently far more complicated when it comes to handling the claims in terms of exactly who the decision makers are going to be sitting around the table. Not the end of the world, just a little bit more complicated. So, as I said right at the get-go, the concept is lovely, but the technology does not help. And what I mean by the technology not helping is that most, if not all of you, will be aware that there are 3 completely different versions of ECF in use in the market. 1 for the Lloyd's market and 2 in the company market, depending on whether we're talking about old ILU companies or Lerma companies. And that is technology that is 40 years old. And so even though we've got 1 intellectual decision maker, what actually has to happen is that the claims has to be presented to, if we've got all 3 London markets on there, to all 3 markets simultaneously. But one of the biggest and most important things is that those 3 versions of ECF, well, basically are quite snobby. They just don't talk to each other. There's very, very little data connectivity between them, which means that this particular process only works as well as it should in terms of the efficiencies that it's seeking to create if every stakeholder in the process knows exactly what they should be doing, and perhaps more importantly, shouldn't be doing. So, starting point is with the broker. So, for our broker friends sitting around the table, you are looking at a claim and you're going, I think this claim might be eligible to be handled under the SCAP rules. Okay, check the slip. Is the SCAP clause in there? Yep, sounds good. Then what you do is that you identify from the slip who the intellectual decision maker is going to be, the SCAP slip leader. And that's important because what you have to do is you have to tell everybody which market that slip leader is in. And you do that by slightly changing the loss name. There's no dedicated SCAP fields in class at all. So we use the leading characters of the loss name to put in the words or the letters SCAP, and then either 1 or 2 characters that will identify which market the leader is in. We'll come back to what those codes are in a moment. Broker then sends the claim down the 3 pipelines, if we'll assume worst case scenario, 2 company markets, 1 Lloyd's, 3 pipelines. And the important thing is that if, as we've got in this example, the intellectual leader is in the Lerma market, so we'll make it Swiss Re, the broker will code the claim SCAP-L. And so when insurers in the ILU market and the Lloyd's market see the claim pop up in their to-do list, they have to leave it alone. How counterintuitive is that? I'm telling you that something in your to-do list, as a claims person, you need to leave it alone. But that is absolutely the truth of the matter. It is only in your to-do list because of the technological limitations of 3 versions of ECF that do not talk to each other. I promise you, if the wheel nuts have stayed on the bus, that once Swiss Re have dealt with it, then your bit will be dealt with by Valenetic DXC, whatever it's calling itself this week, and the transaction that's sitting in your to-do list, all things being equal, should disappear. Now, we will talk about the situations where the wheel nuts have fallen off the bus, but that's what's supposed to happen, okay? So, does it work? Yeah, it does work, actually. There's a lot of transactions that actually go through literally, properly, accurately, without touching the sides. So it's working as it's supposed to work. Yes, sometimes it doesn't work. And there are some situations where it doesn't work because humans have loosened the wheel nuts. And sometimes it doesn't work actually because the robots were never designed to be able to do everything by themselves. So one of the biggest reasons actually for it not working properly is people not leaving it alone. The not perhaps unreasonable human instinct to see something in your to-do list and go, well, if it's in my to-do list, I need to do it. But then also, for example, if the leader is non-bureau, and probably the biggest situation where that would be the case was if the leader is Lloyd's Brussels or Lloyd's Insurance Company, then the broker needs to actually load up those lead comments into the IMR for everybody else to see. Now, it's very tempting, of course, to say, well, no, I'm going to communicate with the leader and I'm going to tell everybody else simultaneously. But that will be queried by Velenetic if that's the case. Sometimes it's simple things like instead of SCAP and then the leader codes, then a gap, then the loss name, that there's no gap between the leader codes and the loss name. Now, the robots at Velenetic cannot see data within a chunk of other data. They need the gaps round it. And so that's why the space between SCAP and the code before the loss name is really, really important. Particularly for Lerma and particularly for the first transaction, there are some mandatory fields that need to be populated. The robot can't do that because it doesn't have the wherewithal to make the choices necessary. So it has to go to a human to deal with. But that's fine. That's the process working as it should do. So, step by step through the practicalities. This is where you will find the clause in the slip. It will be right at the top of the basis of claims agreement. Now, of course, for anybody who's a claims broker sitting around the table, if you're looking at the slip and you can see that it's in the slip, but the underwriters have scratched it out, then you've got nowhere to go from that position. Now, in the early days, of course, of SCAP, and it's now been around for what, 8 years, maybe it had been forgotten, as it wasn't in the templates at that point. And yeah, it could be endorsed on. I mean, hopefully that isn't the case anymore. So everybody has their part to play. The intellectual decision maker is the slip leader. There's no particularly new title there. But let's say, as we've described, that our intellectual decision maker is the Swiss Re, then they still have that other hat of leading the Lerma market. If there is Lloyd's, then there will be a nominal Lloyd's bureau leader. And of course, it's into their workbox that the item will go that then needs to be ignored. And then everybody else will be considered to be a follower. And that's important because they've still got a voice. And it's important to think about who you might complain to if you're not happy with something that's been done. So if you're a follower, you can complain or you talk to your bureau leader. So if you're in the ILU market, you talk to the ILU leader. If you're in the Lloyd's market, you talk to the Lloyd's leader. But then the bureau leaders can talk, of course, to the overall intellectual decision maker. Now, some of you, I'm sure, get involved in the world of line slips. And the cautionary word here is that you could have a line slip as a broker that's got X amount of security on it, and the line slip itself can have the SCAP clause in it. That's absolutely fine. And so we will have somebody identified as the slip leader. But you could have a declaration to that line slip that, for whatever reason, needs other security as well. Maybe the declaration is too big to fit onto that line slip. So you either use 2 line slips, or you maybe support the line slip with open market security. Doesn't really matter what you do, but what's really important to be clear about is how claims are going to be handled. Because it may well be that the declaration is set up so that the open market security is superior to the line slip. And by superior, what I mean is that for that declaration, the overall intellectual decision maker is actually from the open market security and not the line slip. And so just because you are a line slip leader as an insurer, never assume that you will automatically be leading every declaration onto that line slip. You might be, but equally you might not be. Okay, so you need to be really, really clear about that. And obviously, we don't ever want to slow up the claims sort of life cycle by claims being presented to the wrong insurers first time round. So this code, I cannot emphasize how important this code is, because it's an immediate indicator for anybody looking at it where the intellectual decision maker lives. And so always SCAP, not SPAC or PACS. You've got to get the letters in the right order as well, otherwise the robot goes a bit loopy. And then if the intellectual decision maker's in the ILU market, I. If they're in the Lerma market, L. In the Lloyd's market, S for syndicate. And if they're not in any bureau, then NB. And the concept of Lloyd's Brussels being non-bureau might kind of cause some of you a little bit of consternation, because you might go, well, hang on a minute, you know, I handle Lloyd's Brussels claims on ECF. Well, you do, but Lloyd's Brussels is an insurance company, but they use effectively the Lloyd's version of ECF. They do not use the company version of ECF. And so it's that slightly mongrel situation that leads them being called non-bureau. So the code is doing a number of things. It's for you as the broker to tell everybody that's going to be receiving this claim where you believe the intellectual slip leader is. It is to allow the intellectual slip leader to spot it in their to-do list and go, aha, this is a claim that I must deal with. It's for everybody else to go, oh, this is a claim in my to-do list that I need to ignore. And then also, as it goes down the line to DHC Velenetic, it allows the robot to spot that it is a SCAP claim, and also allows for the accurate production of the SCAP notification report that I'll talk about in a minute. So, key thing, as I've said, is that the first person responsible for keeping the wheels on the bus is the broker. So they're going to identify as potentially a SCAP claim, code it, send it off down the 3 pipelines, remembering that if the leader is non-bureau, to have already got their comments and to load them up into the IMR as one of the documents. And then last but not least, making sure all the transactions remain aligned. Now, I just want to pause on this point for a minute, because again, the various ECF functionalities are not helpful in this regard. So, first and foremost, if you're sitting there in your office 2 or 3 days' time, well, probably not 3 days' time, because that'll be Saturday, but and you're looking at your to-do list, and you're, for example, in the Lloyd's market, and you look at it and it says SCAP L. And you go, right, no, Charlotte said that's Lerma, that's not Lloyd's, I'm going to leave it alone. Syndicate, that's the hat I'm wearing, I'm not to touch it. 3, 4, 5, 6 days' time, it's still there. Now, you might be starting to get slightly twitchy and going, hang on a minute, you know, Lloyd's is monitoring us on our response times. It's still sitting there. I need to do something. No, you don't. you need to do some investigating, or you can do some investigating at this point. Now, for those of you on the insurer side who might be using write-back systems, your write-back systems won't help you here. You need to go into ECF itself, because if you go into ECF and you search for a particular UCR, the first screen you'll be shown is a screen that actually shows you the position of the transactions in all of the markets involved. So if there's all three, there'll be a Lloyd's column, a ILU column, and I think Lerma's on the far right. So if you can see your transaction is sitting there in the Lloyd's column, and you can see that the one in the Lerma column is still showing awaiting, it means they haven't touched it yet. So what we've got is potentially to give our company market colleague a little bit of a nudge. But if you're looking at it and you can see there's a transaction in the Lloyd's column, but there's nothing in the Lerma column, your Lerma colleagues are not psychic. They can't respond to something that they haven't actually seen or haven't actually received. So that's an error on the broker's part. And that would be perfectly appropriate for you to prompt the broker at that point to say, hang on a minute, you've coded this SCAP-L. I can't see a Lerma transaction for this. Something else to watch out for is particularly around the resolution of queries. Because in all markets, if there is a query, it is appropriate to delete the transaction and recreate it. But that doesn't necessarily have to be done. But if it's a SCAP claim, it's something definitely to think about, because in the Lerma market, the normal resolution for a query is to actually load a new transaction on top. And that's perfectly acceptable, that's perfectly correct. Whereas in the ILU and the Lloyd's markets, the correct resolution of a query, particularly a data-related query, is to go back into the class transaction, correct that data and re-release it. So it's the same transaction, just re-released again. You can't do that in Lerma. Once a Lerma transaction has been circulated, the data is locked and it cannot be corrected after that point. And so if you are a broker and you have got a data-related error and you've got a SCAP claim, it's definitely worth thinking about taking all of the transactions out and starting again so they stay aligned. Otherwise, you're going to end up with more transactions on the Lerma side, and that, trust me, all four wheel nuts are going to be off and the spare wheel is going to be rolling down the road on that one. So the starting point is the broker. The broker is thinking, right, is this claim SCAP eligible? However, the final decision does not rest with the broker. It rests with the intellectual decision maker, the SCAP slip leader. And so if you are looking at it as the SCAP slip leader, you need to say to yourself, right, do I think this claim is SCAP eligible? And absolutely, if you think that whilst it might be SCAP eligible now, actually it's likely to blow on the numbers, for example, fairly quickly, then you are within your rights to say, actually, no, let's not have it within SCAP. Claims can move from SCAP to non-SCAP. And so it might be that a claim starts its life in SCAP perfectly legitimately, all calm, all quiet. Something comes out of left field that just changes the landscape of the claim, not necessarily driven by the numbers. And again, it is for the SCAP slip leader to decide, right, this claim is no longer SCAP eligible. If it's no longer SCAP eligible, then all that means in reality is that the broker will then take the SCAP leading characters out of the loss name. And when the transactions are sent off down the wire, they're going to appear like normal transactions, if one wants to call them that. But of course, if we carry on using our scenario of the SCAP slip leader being in the Lerma market, what this might then mean, of course, is for our colleagues in the Lloyd's market and the ILU market, that you might be reading into a claims file partway through. It is what it is. It's not the end of the world, but just be aware that that might happen. It is possible for a claim to be handled under the normal rules and then to be put into SCAP partway through. But that is not a decision that the SCAP slip leader and the broker can make unilaterally. If that's going to be done, then all of the current decision makers involved, so that'd be all the Lerma companies, 2 RLU companies and 1 or 2 in Lloyd's, have to agree that effectively they will step back from the decision making and it will become SCAP. So theoretically that can happen, but of course it's going to be fairly rare. Now, certainly from the Lloyd's perspective, when SCAP was first introduced, as I said, whenever it was back in 2017, 2018 now, there was an expectation that leaders would also be on the lookout for claims that should be SCAP, that the broker had not presented as such. In terms of the things I want you to try and remember out of what we're talking about today, that's probably the least important, but it's not unimportant. And certainly I have seen, and I do see examples of situations where insurers are being proactive and saying to a broker, you know, hang on a minute, I think this may well be SCAP eligible, present it that way. So I know I keep going on about leaving it alone, but it is so important. As I said, this is an entirely spit and blue tack process and is so dependent on every stakeholder doing or not doing what they need to do. And as I said, it's very, very counterintuitive to have something in your to-do list and be told positively not to touch it. But the way that process works properly is by you not touching it if you are not the SCAP slip leader. And so, as I said, if you're in the Lloyd's market and it pops up in your to-do list and it says LI or MB, leave it alone. And if everything's going to work properly, it will disappear in good order. As I've said, if it doesn't disappear, then just go and have a look behind the scenes in ECF and just see whether it's as simple as the intellectual slip leader just hasn't responded yet, or actually there is no transaction for the intellectual slip leader to respond to. Particularly on the Lloyd's side, you know, Lloyd's does monitor cycle times, ECF response times, but they were very clear right from the get-go with SCAP, and I don't believe their position's changed, that if you are the Lloyd's bureau leader but not the SCAP overall leader, so it's there in your to-do list by technological default, then no, they are not going to be measuring your nominal response time on that. So the key thing is that DXC Velenetic will do all the responses for everybody that is not the SCAP slip lead. Now, for our colleagues on the Lloyd's side, the overnight messaging will come out from Velenetic in the normal way, but the cause code will actually say SCAP. So if you ingest the cause code into your claims management systems, that's what you will see. But what's also important is there is a daily SCAP notification report, and it's important to understand it is a daily report. It's not a growing report, if that makes sense. And so whoever's responsible for looking at it has got to be quick on the draw and deal with it every day. So basically what the SCAP notification report does is it advises the recipients what's happened on SCAP files the previous day. So for example, it might identify, or it would identify if a SCAP slip leader, for example, has queried the transaction presented to them, but it will allow you just to do any internal regulatory checks that you might need to do. So that's really, really important as well. So I've talked a lot about the robots down at a DXC or at Velenetic, and they are supported by human friends. So the starting point is that for the robot to be able to identify a SCAP claim, SCAP IMBLS space must be clearly in the loss name. Okay. Now, some questions have been asked in previous sessions, particularly from batch brokers, where their systems will put the SCAP identifier at the end of the loss name. That will not work. The robot can't cope with that at all. It's looking for it as the leading characters. So basically what the robot does is it looks at all the UCRs and makes two piles. Things I can do, things I can't do. I will come to the things I can't do as a robot in a moment. But for the things I can do as a robot, they will check the identifier codes. They will check to see what the slip lead has done. And effectively, they're not reading the comments, they're looking at the radio button. So if it's an advice and a Lerma lead has done CAA and they're the slip lead, then the robot is going to say, right, okay, that's going to be duplicated now across ILU and Lloyd's for their agree responses as well. The robot will also look for the existence of documents, both in the claim file and in the policy file. It can't read them. It's just looking to check that they're there. And the inability to read is quite an important bit of where the humans come in. If there's any problems, then it goes off to the humans to deal with. And there are certain scenarios where it'll always go to the humans just because the robot can't deal with it. So where it's SCAP NB, because there's some reading that needs to be done, and also where there are Lerma first advices, because there are mandatory fields in business class and subclass and stuff that need a bit of intellectual wherewithal, and the robot just can't do that. So, just to remind you again why the wheels fall off the bus. Well, quite often the wheels fall off the bus because somebody's seen something in their to-do list and has been too quick off the draw. It's in my to-do list, therefore I must do it. Poof. No. As I said, it's really counterintuitive, and I do apologise for that, although it's not my fault. But always be thinking about, if you see SCAP, is it there because I do have to deal with it, or is it there because of the limitations of ECF? Something that will also make the wheels fall off the bus is a lack of documents. So a complete ECF transaction in any market, but particularly Lloyd's, is data plus documents, okay? So, bureau lead. Bureau lead, not the same as a slip lead. So, overall decision maker, again, we'll stick with the Swiss Re. You're the Lloyd's bureau lead, or you are the ILU bureau lead, and you query it, and pend is just the language for querying in the ILU market. What do you do that for? You shouldn't have even touched it. That's going to put the wheels firmly off the bus again. And then, and I have seen this, and it's a bit weird, but I have seen it. Different transactions, obviously, for the different markets, but then completely different SCAP codes on them. You can imagine that's just going to send the robot completely doolally. So, the humans. If it's SCAP NB, then the first thing the humans are going to do is check for those leaders' comments in the file, because they need to read them to then actually action the transactions in all three markets according to whatever the decision has been from the leader. So, of course, if those comments aren't there, then Velenetic are going to query that. And then the other thing that the humans are going to do, as I've said, is if it's a Lerma first advice, complete those mandatory fields. And then they will just agree for all the Lerma market. Once it's done for transaction one, those mandatory fields are set, so the robot can deal with it after that. So the SCAP slip leader has pretty wide-ranging authority within the confines of the financial and kind of factual limitations. Absolutely, they can instruct experts, no problem there at all. And of course, they would be the sole party to whom those experts would report. Absolutely, they can decline claims, but the kind of pragmatic measuring stick for declinature staying within SCAP is if, as an insurer, you're happy to articulate clearly in your public comments the reason for your declinature. There's no issues around it. There's no sort of coverage questions potentially that might boof up in your face. It can stay SCAP. But if there's any kind of not really sure about this, it comes out of SCAP. Okay. Now, Although SCAP can't be used on binding authorities, SCAP can be used on line slips, and of course there's absolutely no reason why claims cannot be presented in an aggregated form using bordereau for line slips. As long as every claim on that line, on that bordereau, has an incurred sub 250 or currency equivalent, then that's absolutely fine. And then in terms of lost funds or escrows, actually a SCAP slip leader can deal with that even if the numbers are bigger, because actually that's more administrative. So claims can come out of SCAP. We've talked about this a little bit, and both the broker and the leader can drive this. As I said, it could be very simply that the numbers have got too big. Or it could be that there's just something comes out of left field that just makes the claim more complex or controversial than it was originally. Functionality wise, it's really easy. It's just the broker taking those lead letters out of the lost name, and then when the next transaction goes through, easy peasy, it just goes into everybody's to-do list. And as I said, again, the practical reality is that for the two markets that have not been involved in the claim thus far, yes, they're going to have to read in partway through, but as I said, it is what it is. So for our brokers, just a reminder, please keep the transactions aligned. And as I said, it's particularly challenging sometimes because the functionality is not as helpful as it might be. And so you might naturally be responding to a query or an INFT file on the Lerma side by putting in another transaction. But if it's a SCAP file, then another transaction needs to go across all the markets. Now, parallels. This is a really interesting point, and of course it applies across all markets. Absolutely, you can set up a parallel as SCAP, but the master claim file must already be SCAP. And so if you are, I don't know if we have any experts who collect their own fees or any of the fee collecting agents sitting around the table, but anybody setting up a parallel, one of the questions you need to ask or get the information is the main claim, the main UCR, is it being handled as SCAP? If it is, then you can make the fee SCAP. You can't make the fee SCAP just because the numbers are modest, of course, if the main claim is not. For our friends from the ILU market, of course, there is some delegation within the ILU market in terms of advices being just the leader and settlements depending on the combination of other insurers, lead and second. So if you are the slip leader and also the bureau leader of the ILU, make sure that you untick the second ILU field. And then these next two questions are common across all the markets. Any sniff of sanctions, any sniff of Medicare, that needs to come out of SCAP. It's made it too complicated. Everybody needs the opportunity to kind of deal with it from their own position. Now, lead reserves. Our friends in the Lerma market do have a lead reserve field. It is totally visible to the broker, of course, but it's not visible to anybody else. It's not visible to the ILU market. It's not visible to the Lloyd's market. And therefore, if as a Lerma slip leader, you're using that as well, then we've now got dislocation of information of what's going on. So please don't, okay? Now, in terms of the Lerma followers, because of course in outside SCAP, every Lerma carrier generally speaks for itself, then the notification report is really, really important because that allows the Lerma followers to actually look at something and say, whoa, not happy with that, want to put a stop on it. But they've got to be quick. It's got to be within a day. And then last but not least, one of the radio buttons you will see in Lerma is something called contractual condition applies. And the options are yes, no, and small claim. Don't touch it. It defaults to no. Leave it alone. Okay. When SCAP was first introduced, pre-robot, the instructions were to shift it to yes. But now we have the robots. No, leave it alone. Okay. Now, for the Lloyd's market, again, you have lead reserve fields, but you can use them if all you're doing is splitting the broker presented reserve into its constituent parts of indemnity and expert spend. That's fine because the overall number hasn't changed. Please do not use it to ask Velonetic to enter any different reserve from that which the broker is presenting, because exactly the same as the point I made with the Lerma, you are now having different numbers in different markets. Okay. And then in terms of mandatory fields on ECF, you have to deal with, it's a slightly smaller group than normal, but still some fairly basic ones. So remember with comments that public comments are visible cross markets as long as the transactions are aligned, cross markets, and also to the broker. But private comments are literally what they say on the tin. The private comments on the Lloyd's side are visible to all Lloyd's carriers plus DXC/Velonetic. On the company market side, they tend to be internal to carriers, so of no real relevance or help to anybody outside. So queries. If you are the SCAP slip leader, so the only person that's should be touching this claim, absolutely you can query it. That's entirely your prerogative, but as I'm sure all of you have your own internal protocols, if you can pick up the phone or email the broker and get communication going that way to get resolved whatever the issue is, then that's obviously to be preferred. But if you can't do that, then absolutely you can query inf pend depending on which market you happen to be in. If you do, then the next day's SCAP notification report will show that that transaction is in queried state. But please, 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 if you are the bureau leader, not the slip leader, the bureau leader, then leave it alone. Don't query it just because you've seen they've queried it. No, you don't have to. That will be dealt with in the background. So, to reinforce the point about how and why the wheel nuts fall off. Coding not being done properly, either just spelling, order of letters being wrong, or particularly no gap being left between the SCAP code and the lost name. Now, threshold. The threshold, as I've said, is net value to this slip, 250,000 sterling or equivalent. Let's just explore what I mean by to this slip. I talked earlier about the fact that you could have placements that involved off slips. So you could have a claim that is absolutely humongous, but you're presenting a claim on a little off slip with a 5% order. It may well be that the maths means that the net value of the claim to the insurers on that little off slip is sub 250. You can call that SCAP, that's absolutely fine. Equally, if you're on a layered program, you might be right up in the clouds. Everything underneath you might be complete toast, but the claim's just prodding a little bit into your layer. If the net value of the claim to those insurers at that layer, sub 250, you can call it SCAP. You could have a claim that is $1 million from the ground up, but the insured has an $800,000 retention. Well, the net value of the claim to this slip is going to be, in that case, less than 250,000 sterling. Okay? But the robot is not looking at the numbers. It's entirely down to the humans to look at the numbers. And one of the biggest issues has been basically, let's call it perhaps sometimes slightly cheeky use of SCAP, where it has been used where the numbers have been a lot bigger, and because either nobody's been paying attention or whatever the context might be, they've gone through a SCAP with much, much bigger numbers. And all that does is it fosters concern fosters disquiet about the use of it. And as I said, when I talk right at the end about the future, you'll see what I mean. We've talked about all those other reasons for things falling off the bus. And I know it sounds like I'm saying things over and over again, but we're, what, 7 years in, at least 8 years in, and I'm still seeing the same things happening, the same basic things not being done or being done. And as I've said, the technology is wholly unhelpful. It is totally dependent on every human in the chain to know, right, what are the rules of the game? What should I be doing? What shouldn't I be doing to allow the process to actually work as smoothly as it possibly can? So the LMG website, the Lloyd's London Market Group website, has got a library, and you can find the full wording of the clause in there, as well as the guidance notes. Now, the guidance notes are, they're quite a weighty document. It's about 30 odd pages, but it just gives you the context of everything I've been talking about. And then there were some quite lengthy FAQ documents that were produced after the first of these kind of refresher sessions we did now sort of 5 years ago. And those certainly on the LMA website, and they'll be sent out, I think, with these materials as well, the links to them. So there's plenty of resources there. So a couple more questions just to finish off, and then I will close off and give you back a little bit of your day. So Justin, can we have question number 3, please? So this is for everybody. This is for brokers, underwriters, everybody. So there's a good question just come in about potential increase to the threshold. I'll talk about that in a minute when I wrap. Okay, so everybody who wants to vote should have had a chance to vote by now. So let's have a look at the results, please, Justin. There we go. So if we go into the middle about the visibility of stats, well, really that's down to the various associations, to the LMA, to the RUA, to LIBA, about getting getting those stats and getting those out to their various populations, about getting that visibility so everybody can see what's going on. It's important. The higher limits point I will talk about in a moment. In terms of the more comfort about other insurers' claims teams, there's kind of a number of ways of looking at that, I suppose. Is the comfort around just lack of knowledge and awareness and connectivity with other insurers' claims teams? Is it, actual, we've seen them do really bad stuff? I know that's two ends of quite a long spectrum. And so it is something that will ultimately need to be resolved. And hopefully, Justin, we've got one more question. Okay, well, this should be a fairly easy question. Okay, let's have the answer to that, please, or the results. Okay, interesting. Pretty much 50-50 split. So thank you, you can close the results down. Thank you very much, Justin. So when SCAP first came out, there were certain sectors of the market who basically said we don't get out of bed for less than $1 million. So it's of no use to us if it's not 1 million. But it was very much felt, no, let's just see if as a market we can get it to work at as 250. And there has been a lot of pressure historically from the broking community, who were really the catalyst for SCAP in the first place, saying, come on, come on, come on, we need to raise the limits to make it more useful. And the voices got louder again when Lloyd's changed the claims lead arrangements to make it that claims of a value below 1 million would only be handled by one pair of eyes. From talking to Tom Hughes at the IUA this morning, I think that argument the can had been sent down the road because of the supposed changes that were going to be coming in, the middle of last year, in terms of getting rid of the 3 versions of ECF and having only one central cloud-based claims platform, etc., etc. I think where we are at the moment is that there seems to be an appetite to reopen the conversation about saying, is SCAP working? Would it be used more if the numbers were bigger? I think the negative voices, and I'm not saying I disagree with them actually, were saying, well, if the market can't use it properly, and this is what I mean by that, leaving things alone and knowing what to do in your particular role, if they can't do it properly when the levels are 250, what's going to happen if the levels are bigger? So in answer to the question that was posed in the Q&A, I think there might be some more active discussions in the next few months about it, just because I think particularly the kicking the can down the road, waiting for ICOS to come in, it is not really going to work anymore. So watch this space. I don't have any particular intelligence about when those conversations are going to be, or whether 1 million is going to be the number or something else. So hopefully for some of you, you're going out going, well, excellent, I've got my CPD points and it's just reinforced that I do know what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's absolutely fine. That's a good use of both your and my time. But for some of you, if you're going out going, oh, actually, no, I'd forgotten about that, or no, perhaps I haven't been doing that, or I have been doing that, then that's equally important as well. Because as I've said, the idea is great, but the process is incredibly human driven. There is little or no technological help for you. You've got to remember what your role is in the process. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. Losing my voice. Any more questions that anybody's got, either to pop in the Q&A or pop in the chat? Charlotte?
I just wanted to come back online and say thank you very much for doing the presentation today. I have been online, but I'm going to have to drop off now, I'm afraid, before you're closed for another session here. So I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you to Justin, and thank you to everyone who's joined the call today. As mentioned, this was being recorded.